Hello everybody, Happy New Year, and let's start with a new article. This is against communitarism. Communitarism is among the most pernicious schools of contemporary progressivism. Maybe you've never heard of it, but the truth is that it manages to orient positions and opinions in the left-wing political field. Communitarianism was born in the early 80s in controversy with John Rawls, one of the most illustrious political philosophers of the last century. But let's go in order. What is communitarianism? It is a philosophy that emphasizes the importance of the relation between the individual and the community. The identity of a person, therefore language, traditions, values, depends on the relationships that they as entertained with their life with their community. It seemed to hear the echo of the Aristotelian idea that the man is a political animal, and it is not conceivable but in the group in which it is born and grows. The communitarian vision of man would like to oppose the one presumably advocated by the Enlightenment and liberalism, a vision of an absolute man, isolated, endowed of thought and rationality, independent of their personal life experiences. Communitarianism is a philosophical current that attacks liberalism from the left, but, as we will see later, it offers fertile hints to conservatism and to authoritarian currents of thought, from communism to nationalism, passing through confessionalism, which is the idea that the dictates of a religion should shape public life. As I said, the communitarian tendency arises from a polemic and a controversy, and I add from a gross misunderstanding of a text of 1961 by John Rawls, A Theory of Justice. It goes without saying, therefore, that in order to understand something about communitarianism, we must first outline the essential features of the book that gave rise to everything. First of all, it is good to remember that John Rawls was a liberal thinker of progressive orientation. In his A Theory of Justice, he tries to identify principles that can at the same time guarantee the freedom and diversity of opinions and values of individuals on the one hand, and encourage the establishment of a more just society on the other. Rawls' first move is to separate the good from the right. By good, we mean the conception of the good life, of happiness, which presupposes values and beliefs that for Rawls refer to individual and not to the community, here understood as public society. Everyone must be free to pursue their own happiness or purpose in life in the way they deem most appropriate. For right, Rawls intends instead the set of minimum rules of the game of public and political coexistence, and are as little as possible characterized, and that can therefore be suitable for all participants. As a philosopher respectful of the freedom and diversity of individuals, Rawls decides to focus only on the right, on the principles that inspire social justice, principles that offer a way, I quote, offer a way of assigning rights and duties in the basic institutions of society, end quote, and that, quote, define the appropriate distributions of benefits and burdens of social cooperation, end quote. For the fans of political philosophy, in a certain sense, Rawls is therefore placed in the wake of social contractualism ushered by the first Enlightenment thinkers, Grotius and Hobbes. John Rawls identifies two principles, and I quote here. First, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. Second, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both a. reasonably expected to be everyone's advantage, b. and attached to positions open to all. End quote. If the first principle sounds perfectly normal, the second may instead cause someone to wince. In what way can inequalities benefit everyone? The answer is that in a truly free society, the difference cannot but emerge. But for Rawls, the idea to pursue is that everyone has virtually the opportunity to improve their own condition over the others, without these being to the detriment of the society. For the hard and pure socialists, it is an inadmissible ideal, but for ideologies that venerate individual freedom, hence also anarchism, it is not. One can live in an ideal society while maintaining differences in social and economic status. This is what Rawls calls difference principle. To accompany the readers to these conclusions, Rawls asked them to do an experiment of imagination. Here's how it could be synthetically reformulated. Imagine not being born yet. Imagine being in one place and meeting other people like you who are not yet born. You still keep all your mental faculties, but you do not know who you are. Who do you know? You do not know what your sex will be, how intelligent you will be, or skillful or healthy, in which family you will be born, nor in which religion, what political values your parents will impart to you. Now, you are asked to agree with others on what general characteristics the country in which you will be born should have. The future assignment in the society will be totally random, as in a lottery. You could be born in an extremely happy family, full of comfort, as well in one marked by hardships and privations. What should be the principles that inspire the social institutions of the country in which you will be born? According to Rawls, such a mental experiment helps better understand the meaning of the two principles expressed above. The veil of ignorance of the original position before birth leads to the elaboration of an idea of justice intended as fairness. Everyone must be free while respecting the freedom of others, but in the context of a society able to offer the same opportunities to the disadvantaged and to take care of them. When I said that Rawls tried to outline the minimum set of rules for public coexistence, I did not mean that they are neutral. They are rather politically oriented. The justice outlined by Rawls is typical of a liberal democratic country with a particular focus on social issues. His merit is that he tried to provide a logical and rational foundation for a liberal progressive political ideal. For this, Rawls was hailed as the major theoretical point of reference for American liberals. For what it is worth saying, during his presidency, Bill Clinton regularly invited him to dinner to discuss his ideas. But as I said at the beginning of the article, Rawls' approach would have been criticized about 10 years later. The main opponents were two philosophers placed on the left, Alasdair MacIntyre with his After Virtue of 1981 and Michael Sandel with Liberalism and the Limits of Justice of 1982. The first is a philosopher who has tried to reconcile Marxism with Christian morality. In addition to Marx, Alasdair is an admirer of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. According to him, the Enlightenment, too busy to exalt the rationality and the universality of the human condition, has been unsuccessful because it has failed to provide a solid moral foundation. There is no need to go into the details of his arguments. For our discussion, we need to know that MacIntyre takes up the teleological approach of Aristotle's philosophy. In other words, he proposes to recover a moral philosophy that gives a purpose to individuals and to the community. While, therefore, for Rawls it was fundamental to allow everyone the freedom to pursue their own happiness and their goals in the most convenient ways, MacIntyre indirectly supports the idea that society must give itself aims to which the individual must conform. But MacIntyre's criticism does not stop here. According to him, In fact, liberalism, the son of enlightenment, is the cause of the alleged disintegration of society and of the moral disorientation of individuals. Liberal philosophy would have proved too far individualistic and would have promoted selfishness, the real beating heart of the economic system, capitalism, guilty of having shaped immoral societies, obsessed with the god of money. Accordingly, MacIntyre attacks Rawls as a theorist of an individualistic liberalism. The imaginative experiment of the original position would give an abstract and artificial image of man and would completely overlook the relational aspect of human morality. Rawls is accused of denying the link between the individual and their community of belonging. The other main critic of Rawls' theory is Michael Sandel, a thinker who stands in the wake of progressive liberalism. He criticized Rawls' mental experiment because he hypothesizes a man capable of making judgments but unencumbered, totally detached from their experiences and relationships. The values, morals, and ability to judge of a man cannot be given without the relational context in which they was born and raised. Similar to MacIntyre, Sandel criticizes Rawls for providing a distorted image of a human nature. Man, according to Sandel, man is unthinkable outside the community of belonging and the values that it expresses, and therefore it is impossible to believe that they can at the same time make judgments and imagine them oneself in an original position as Rawls described it. This is a little bit unclear, I'm sorry for that, but I won't record another video, sorry. The criticism of MacIntyre and Sandel originated from a substantial misunderstanding of Rawls' mental experiment. In vain, the philosopher tried to answer the accusation of communitarians. In 1993 with the book Political Liberalism, and in 1999 with the article Justice as Fairness, Political Not Metaphysicals, Rawls made it clear that with the expedience of the original position and the veil of ignorance, he had no pretension to describe the nature of man, their essence. He simply wanted to find a logical tool for arriving at a political conception of justice. But at that point the die was drawn, and communitarianism would hire more or less conscious epigons intent on redefining progressive political theory. And here the troubles begin, because the idea that the communities, especially the linguistic, ethnic, and religious communities, are depositories of dedicated rights, begins to creep up. And the problem is not just defining what a community is, where it starts and where it ends, who is part and to what extent and who is not, but also how community rights can compete and even clash with the rights of individuals. One thing is to attribute a legal status dedicated to a traditional community that lives in a well-defined territories, perhaps protected by laws that safeguard the environment and the ecosystem, as in the case of the indigenous communities in countries such as the United States, Brazil, and Australia, etc. Another thing is to define a community when its members are inserted in a socially varied society, and live more or less scattered in a territory of a country, as can be, for example, the case of the so-called black communities, white communities, Christian communities, Muslim communities, gay communities, etc. In the latter case, in fact, the idea of community turns out to be terribly slippery and simplified, and risks becoming an instrument of power in the hands of those who represent them before the law, perhaps on the basis of not exactly democratic elective processes. It is the typical case of the so-called minorities. The illusion of being able to establish the boundaries of such a community goes hand in hand with the illusion of defining a culture. The question of the community is very often linked with a cultural question, Elsewhere, I mentioned a sort of fetishism of cultures, a very common tendency, especially in the progressive field. The idea is that culture, that is, the set of traditions, beliefs, and values of an historically characterized group, is always a positive thing and must be protected from any kind of homogenization. Culture is beautiful, it is wealth, and must be preserved at all costs. This approach, declined in various ways both on the right and on the left, is ill-founded for two main reasons. The first is that it considers culture as well-definable objects, always equal to themselves in the course of history, as unbreakable monoliths. This is a clear self-deception. Cultures are constantly changing. They are dynamic systems that are strongly influenced by external influences, such as legal and technological progress. In this case, all those who publicly refer to the imaginary, real values, cultural values of the past, perform a conservative political operation when not fully nostalgic, regressive, or reactionary, not progressive for sure. And indeed, the most strenuous defenders of cultures are often clerics and right-wing and far-right politicians. From this point of view, for example, it is to be understood the obsession with the nativity scene or the Christmas play in schools so fashionable lately in Italy. The second reason lies in another misunderstanding of the nature of cultures. What in fact escapes most is that as systems of values and traditions, cultures justify in various ways injustice, violence, and oppression. Sad but true. Perhaps that, for example, the Christian or Muslim tradition did not preach the submission of woman to man, or the censorship of sexual behavior for those who are not heterosexual. It is not true that many cultures have promoted the division of society into non-communicating castes. But I could go further. It is not culture the value system of which the mafia has been nourished, such as the code of silence, honor, summary justice, and unconditionally submission to the leader. No one is saying that we must erase cultures as bearers of bad things, but only that the principles of freedom, justice, and dignity of the individual come first, and therefore, when there is a conflict between fundamental rights of the individual and safeguard of culture, I will always give priority to the first ones. Here is a progressive position for me. But communitarianism precisely opens the way to the opposite tendency, namely the idea that the community can be the custodian of rights in contrast to those of its members, which results in the unfortunate consequence that the community ends up deciding for individuals who more or less voluntarily belong to it. Does it seem an exaggeration? Not at all. It is enough to consider multiculturalism, one of the main theoretical products of communitarianism, the idea that in modern societies where different cultures live together, it is necessary to ensure that the difference between the various communities are preserved. Among the most damaging theorists we find the Canadian Will Kimlicka, also from the self-styled progressive field, who in 1995 published Multicultural Citizenship, a liberal theory of minority rights. In short, Kimlicka proposes to introduce minority rights alongside universal rights. According to him, special rights should be given to each community, at the same time taking into account the specificity of the community and the most effective strategies to get it out of a state of disadvantage and marginalization. Such a proposal, although dictated by the good intention, turns out to be a sort of abortion of the philosophy of love. Not only would it be arbitrary to establish which community should be recognized and which is not, but it would be also very difficult to prevent the community from imposing its will on the individual, limiting their freedom. For example, let's say that a community protected by special laws has a strong religious character and wants to exercise control over its members. How then do you effectively protect the single member who wants to convert to another religion or simply abandon it? I remember that in many countries the crime of apostasy still exists, and that for many it is still a serious offense to be punished even with death. More generally, the idea of assigning special rights to groups is simply medieval. It violates the principle of enlightenment, that law must be the same for all without distinction. When the law is not universal, but only applies to a group, then it is called privilege, which is exactly the opposite of the concept of right. From this point of view, Will Kymlicka and the many followers of the multiculturalism advocate a differentiated legal system on an ethnic religious basis that effectively reduces individual freedoms and consequently foster the creation of parallel societies within the same country. They want segregation rather than social cohesion and integration. But fortunately, the progressive field has also produced critics of the multiculturalist approach. Kenan Malik, for example, a British thinker of Indian origin, and his Multiculturalism and its discontents, Rethinking Diversity After 9/11, 2013, Malik argues that multiculturalism has failed in its intentions. Rather than promoting cohesive societies able to respect cultural differences, it has pushed communities to isolate themselves and, above all, has personally denied its members the possibility of self-determination and exit from marginality. To this, it must be added that the protection of the communities generally risks threatening freedom of expression. In the name of respect for cultures, one can in fact come to the conclusion that certain opinions and criticism but must be limited or even censored if they offend the sensibility of the members of a community. Malik explains, and he's perfectly right, that freedom of expression tends by its very nature to arouse even heated reactions, and that therefore to speak of a freedom of expression that does not offend is a logical absurdity. Who would establish the measure of a respectful criticism? Only a form of censorship. It is no coincidence that Malik is very skeptical about the so-called Islamophobia, a fashion term in the United Kingdom, because it dangerously oscillates between discrimination against Muslims and the critique of the Islamic religion. The critique of the authorities of thought, therefore also of the dogmatic systems of religion, is an enlightenment foundation of the modern state. We should never forget it. But Kenan Malik opposes also those who criticize multiculturalism from the right, and he does so with motivations very similar to those seen so far. The nationalist right, in fact, unites the importance of the original culture and the urgent need to defend it from external influences. It fights for the preservation of an hypothetical purity of tradition and values, which the foreigner risks threatening by importing and imposing their own. This right does not want integration, pursues a phantom assimilation. It uses monoculturalism against multiculturalism. But right-wing monoculturalism runs the same misunderstanding of culture. Even for the nostalgic of the local tradition, culture has the appearance of a monolith always equal to itself. And above all, the identity of the individual is totally coincident with the presumed collective identity. And also in this case, the attack on freedom of expression and criticism is a serious risk. But there is another way to respond to multiculturalism and to communitarianism in general, far more respectful of individual liberties, namely cosmopolitanism. If it is true that conditions in which we are born and grow, country, city, community, family, sexuality, influence the construction of our own identity, in the final analysis, each individual is unique and unrepeatable, and will never be due to this or that system of values that characterizes a group or a community. The truth is that we are all the same or equal because we are all different. The principle of the universality of laws arises precisely from these considerations. The fight against discrimination must therefore continue, but only if we keep in mind that the differences must be respected and protected as a personal, not as a collective matter. Okay, thank you very much, and see you next time.